Graham Vale had enough money to cross the country in a private jet before most men finished breakfast. But money did not prepare him for the sight of his mother in the Vermont woods, living in a half-buried cabin with snow packed against the door and smoke rising from a stove outside. When he reached for his phone to call his aunt, Lillian grabbed his wrist and whispered, "Don't tell Marla you found me. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments." 3 weeks earlier, the forest had only been a business opportunity. Graham Vale sat inside his glass-walled office above a private hangar in Burlington, looking over a land packet thick enough to be a small novel. Outside the window, one of his jets gleamed under the winter sun while mechanics moved around it in dark coats and headsets. Everything in Graham's life was polished, scheduled, and expensive. The forest parcel was different. It sat deep in northern Vermont, nearly 500 acres of pine, birch, frozen streams, and old logging roads. To Graham's clients, it would be perfect. A private aviation retreat, a place where wealthy people could land nearby, disappear into luxury cabins, drink expensive whiskey by stone fireplaces, and tell themselves they were experiencing wilderness. The broker had called it rare, his investors had called it undervalued, Graham had called it useful. He turned a page and saw a note clipped to the survey. Unpermitted forest cabin on interior clearing, removal recommended prior to closing. He barely paused at the line. Old cabins were common on rural land. Hunting shacks, abandoned homesteads, illegal weekend builds. Usually they were half-rotten, full of animal nests, and easier to tear down than explain. His assistant had asked whether he wanted someone else to inspect it. Graham said no. He wanted to walk the land himself before signing, not because he loved forests, because he knew rich men paid more for privacy when the person selling it had seen the land with his own eyes. The next morning he drove north in a black Range Rover instead of taking a company helicopter. Snow lined the road in hard gray banks. Towns grew smaller, gas stations became fewer, cell signal faded in and out. By the time he reached the old logging entrance, the world had gone quiet in a way he was not used to. A local survey marker pointed him toward a narrow trail. Graham parked, zipped his coat, and started walking. The forest was colder than he expected. Not city cold, not the kind that came with salted sidewalks and warm lobbies nearby. This cold felt older. It sat in the trees and pressed through the seams of his gloves. After nearly 20 minutes, the trail opened into a clearing. At first, he did not see a cabin. He saw a low shape under snow, rounded and earth-colored, almost like a mound rising from the ground. Smoke drifted from a stone structure several yards away, not from a chimney, but from what looked like an outdoor stove beneath a rough wooden cover. Then the door opened. A woman stepped out carrying an armful of split wood. She was thin, too thin. Her gray hair was pulled back under a wool hat. Her coat hung loosely from her shoulders. Her hands looked cracked and red from cold and work. For one terrible second, Graham thought she was some stranger living illegally on land he was about to buy. Then she looked up. The wood slipped from her arms. Graham stopped breathing. "Mom?" Lillian Vale stared at him as if the forest itself had spoken. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked older than the last photo Marla had sent him. Much older, not just aged but worn down. Her cheeks were hollow. Her eyes, once sharp and warm, seemed guarded now, as if they had learned to expect harm before kindness. Graham crossed the clearing fast. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out rough. "You're supposed to be at Green Hollow. Marla said you were staying somewhere quiet, somewhere with care." At the mention of Marla's name, Lillian's face changed. Fear moved through it so quickly that Graham almost missed it. Almost. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling her." Lillian grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "No, Mom, you're freezing out here. Don't tell Marla you found me." The words landed harder than the cold. Graham stared at her hand on his sleeve. It was trembling. Not from confusion, not from weakness, from fear. Why would you be afraid of Marla? Lillian looked past him toward the trees, as if expecting someone to appear between them. "You shouldn't have come through the main road," she whispered. "Someone may have seen your car." Graham felt the first real crack open inside him. For months, every update about his mother had come through Marla. Lillian was resting. Lillian did not want calls. Lillian was becoming forgetful. Lillian was safer away from stress. He had believed all of it because believing it had been convenient. He looked back at the cabin, snow pressed against its curved walls. The outdoor stove gave off a dull orange glow. Inside the open doorway he saw shelves, blankets, jars, and a flat stone set into the center of the floor. "This ends now," he said. "You're coming with me." Lillian shook her head. "I can't leave yet, you can barely stand." Her eyes filled but her voice steadied. "There is something under this house, Graham. Something your aunt has been trying to find. If Marla gets this forest, she won't just sell the land." She turned slowly and pointed toward the flat stone in the middle of the cabin floor. "She'll destroy the only thing that can prove the truth." Graham did not move for several seconds. The flat stone in the middle of the cabin floor looked ordinary, worn smooth, dark around the edges. A little warmer than the rest of the room maybe, though he could not tell whether that was real or only the effect of the fire outside. But his mother was staring at it like it was the last locked door between her and ruin. "Mom," he said carefully, "what truth?" Lillian's eyes stayed on the stone. "Not here, not while the road is open. That doesn't make any sense, it will." Her voice was weak, but it carried something Graham had not heard from her in a long time. Certainty. Not confusion, not panic. Certainty. That frightened him more than if she had fallen apart. He looked around the cabin again, this time not as a buyer inspecting a problem on a land packet, but as a son trying to understand how his mother had ended up living in a place he would not have allowed one of his employees to sleep for a night. The walls were curved and thick, made of packed earth and straw. Shelves were carved into them. Clay jars sat in neat rows. Wool blankets were folded on a wooden bench. A kettle rested near the door, close enough to be carried outside to the stove. Everything was poor, but nothing was careless. "Get your coat," he said. "Whatever is under there can wait an hour. I'm taking you somewhere warm." Lillian gave him a tired look. "This is warmer than you think, Mom." "You still think warmth comes from vents and thermostats," he almost answered sharply, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. Her lips had a faint bluish cast. This was not the time to argue about design. He stepped closer and softened his voice. "Please, come with me. I'll lock the cabin. I won't call Marla yet. But I need to get you checked out." The promise changed her face. Not relief exactly, more like calculation. She was deciding how much trust she could afford. "You won't tell her?" "Not yet." "You won't let anyone come here?" "I'll lock it." She looked toward the stone again. Then she nodded once. It took 15 minutes to gather what she insisted on bringing. Not clothes, not medicine first, papers. A wrapped bundle from a shelf, a small notebook from beneath a clay jar, a ring of old keys hanging behind the door. Graham watched her choose each item with painful care, as if every object had been placed there for a reason. He wanted to ask what they were. He did not. Not yet. When he helped her across the clearing, she kept glancing at the tree line. Graham followed her gaze more than once. The forest looked empty. Snow sat on the branches. The trail behind him had already begun to blur under a light wind. Still, he felt watched. He got Lillian into the passenger seat and turned the heat up as high as it would go. She flinched at the sudden blast of air, then closed her eyes. In the bright leather interior, she looked even smaller. The contrast made Graham feel sick. The dashboard alone probably cost more than every object inside that cabin. He drove back toward town slowly. His tires slipped twice on the narrow road. Lillian kept one hand on the wrapped bundle in her lap. "What did Marla tell you?" she asked. Graham kept his eyes forward. "About what? About me?" He hesitated too long. Lillian opened her eyes. "That bad?" "She said you wanted quiet. She said you were tired of people asking questions. She said you didn't want calls most days." A faint smile touched Lillian's mouth, but there was no humor in it. "That sounds like Marla." She always knew how to make abandonment sound like respect. The words hit him harder than he expected. "I didn't abandon you." Lillian looked at him then, not angrily, worse, gently. "I know what you thought you were doing, Graham." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. For years, his life had been built on motion. Meetings, flights, contracts, maintenance schedules, client crises at midnight. He had told himself that his mother was cared for. He had paid for it. He had approved every transfer Marla requested. He had believed his aunt because Marla was efficient, and efficiency was the language Graham understood. Now his mother sat beside him with cracked hands and a secret bundle in her lap. The motel near the edge of town was the only place still taking winter guests. Graham booked the largest room they had, though it was still small by his standards: a queen bed, a radiator that clicked loudly, a faded painting of Lake Champlain, and a bathroom with chipped tile. Lillian stood near the bed for a moment, as if unsure whether she was allowed to sit on it. That small hesitation broke something in him. "Mom," he said quietly. "Sit down," she did. Slowly, Graham called the front desk for soup, tea, extra blankets, and a local nurse referral. Then he locked the cabin keys in the room's safe because Lillian asked him to. Only after she drank half a cup of tea did he step outside into the hall and pull out his phone. He did not call Marla. Instead, he searched for Green Hollow Senior Residence. The website looked clean and expensive: warm lighting, smiling adults in wool sweaters, words like dignity, independence, and personalized care. He called the number. A receptionist answered on the third ring. "This is Graham Vale," he said. "I'm calling about my mother, Lillian Vale. I need to confirm her residency status." A pause followed, keyboard clicks. Then another pause. "I'm sorry, sir," the woman said. "Could you repeat the name?" He did, more typing. "We have no current resident by that name." Graham felt the hallway tilt slightly. "Former resident? I don't see anyone by that name in our resident system. My aunt arranged it. Marla Vale? Maybe it was under her contact information." Another pause, more typing. "We do have an inquiry record from Marla Vale several months ago," the receptionist said. "But no admission, no signed residency agreement, and no stay." Graham stood very still. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir, I'm sure." He ended the call without saying goodbye. For a moment he just stared at the phone in his hand. Months of updates, quiet residence, good staff, less stress, no need to visit yet, she's adjusting, give her space. None of it had been true. Before he could turn back toward the room, his phone rang. Marla. Her name lit up the screen like a warning. Graham let it ring twice, then answered. "Aunt Marla." "Oh, thank God," she said, breathless in a way that sounded practiced. "Where are you?" "Dale Palmer just called me. He said someone drove into the North Parcel this morning." "Graham, please tell me that wasn't you." He looked down the motel hallway toward his mother's door. "Why would Dale call you?" "Because I manage the property issues," Marla said quickly. "You know that. The cabin is dangerous. I told the broker we'd handle it before closing." "We?" A tiny pause. "The trust," she corrected. "The family trust." Graham's chest tightened. He had not mentioned the cabin. He had not mentioned the forest. He had not mentioned finding Lillian. Marla kept talking. "Listen to me carefully. If your mother contacted you, you need to understand she's not well. She gets paranoid. She twists things. She has been obsessed with that off-grid nonsense for years. Homesteading, mud walls, heat storage, all of it. It's part of why I've tried to keep stress away from her." Graham closed his eyes. There it was. The explanation ready before he had asked the question. "She's unstable, Graham," Marla continued, her voice softening. "And if she starts interfering with the land sale, everything your grandmother built could be tied up for years. You have to let me handle this." He opened his eyes. Through the gap beneath the motel room door, he could see the shadow of his mother moving slowly inside. She was not hiding from winter. She was hiding from someone who knew exactly how to make her sound unreliable. "I'll call you back," Graham said. "Graham, don't do anything emotional." He almost laughed. Emotional. That was what people like Marla called it when someone finally stopped obeying a lie. He ended the call and went back into the room. Lillian was sitting on the edge of the bed with the wrapped bundle open beside her. Inside were old envelopes, a small notebook, and a folded document tied with faded string. Her face changed when she saw him. "You called Green Hollow," she said. He nodded. "They told you I was never there." Again he nodded. She looked down at her hands. "I wrote to you from the cabin, more than once. The letters came back." Graham swallowed. "Why didn't you email me?" "I did." The room went quiet. Then Lillian reached into the bundle and pulled out a printed email. It had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were nearly torn through. Graham took it from her carefully. At first he saw only his mother's name. Then he saw the forwarding line at the top. The email had not gone directly to him. It had been forwarded through Marla's account. At the bottom was a scanned signature on a land sale consent form. Lillian Vale. Graham stared at it until the letters blurred, because the signature looked perfect. Too perfect. It looked exactly like the signature from an old medical authorization Marla had sent him 2 years earlier. Same slant, Same pressure, same broken loop in the L, not similar. Identical. Graham stared at the signature for so long that Lillian finally reached across the bed and folded the page shut. "You see it now," she said quietly. He nodded. The problem was not that the signature looked wrong. The problem was that it looked too right. In business, Graham signed hundreds of documents every month. He knew how signatures changed over time. People rushed, their hands aged, stress altered pressure and rhythm. Even identical twins could not reproduce handwriting perfectly across years. Yet the signature on the land consent form matched an older document almost line for line. "When did you sign this?" he asked. "I didn't." The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Graham looked at her. "You never signed anything approving the sale?" "I signed tax forms, insurance forms, a medical release after a procedure 3 years ago. Nothing about selling the forest." He felt anger building inside him, but anger was not evidence. He had learned that lesson years ago in business negotiations. He needed facts, real ones. The next morning, he drove to the county records office before sunrise. The building sat between the courthouse and an old brick post office. It was smaller than he expected. No marble, no polished steel, just fluorescent lights, worn linoleum floors, and shelves packed with decades of property records. A woman in her 60s sat behind the records desk. Her nameplate read Nora Bell. She looked up over her glasses. "What can I help you with?" Graham introduced himself and explained that he wanted to review documents connected to a family trust holding forest property outside town. Nora listened carefully. Unlike brokers, investors, and corporate attorneys, she never seemed impressed by his name. "Trust records are public only in certain parts," she said. "I can show you filings, deeds, amendments that were recorded, and transfer documents. I can't interpret them for you." "That's fine." It took nearly an hour. The deeper he went into the files, the less the situation made sense. The forest was not owned directly by Lillian. It belonged to a family conservation trust established years earlier. The trust had protections attached to it, environmental restrictions, usage limitations, requirements for trustee approval, not impossible to sell, but far more complicated than Marla had implied. Graham leaned closer. "Can I see all amendments?" Nora disappeared into the archive room. When she returned, she carried a thin folder. "There aren't many." He opened it. Most of the paperwork was routine. Then he found an amendment filed years earlier. His pulse quickened. The document specifically referenced continued stewardship rights connected to Lillian's living status and decision-making authority. But something felt wrong. The page numbers jumped, page 1, page 2, page 3, then directly to a notarized attachment. No final page, no conclusion, no signature section, no ending. Graham looked up. "Is this incomplete?" Nora adjusted her glasses. "It appears to be. Where's the last page?" "If it's not in the recorded file, I don't know." She studied the index sheet attached to the folder. Then her expression changed slightly. "The archive reference indicates 4 pages. Graham looked back down. Only 3 existed. A silence settled between them. Neither said what they were thinking. Someone had removed a page. Not necessarily recently, but at some point. "Can I get copies of what's here?" "Yes." As the copier hummed, Graham stared through the office window at snow drifting across the courthouse lawn. For the first time, the missing page felt more important than the signature. Because signatures could be challenged. A missing page suggested intent. Nora handed him the copies. Then she hesitated. "If you're dealing with trust questions," she said carefully, "there's someone you may want to talk to." "Who?" "Helen Ross." The name meant nothing to him. Probate attorney, semi-retired. Worked with a lot of old family trusts in this county. "You know her?" "I know she handled paperwork for Eleanor Vale." Graham froze. His grandmother. The woman who had originally built the strange cabin. "Do you have her number?" Nora slid a business card across the counter. "I'd call before driving out there." He slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you." As he turned toward the door, Nora spoke again. "Mr. Vale?" He stopped. "The missing page may matter." "That's what I think too." Nora nodded slowly. "Then don't assume whoever removed it stopped at 1 page." The drive back toward the forest felt longer. The trees seemed darker, the silence heavier. By late afternoon, he reached the cabin again. Lillian was outside stacking wood near the stone stove. She looked exhausted but calmer than she had at the motel. The moment she saw him, she knew. "You found something?" "Maybe." She listened while he explained the missing page. The entire time, her face remained expressionless, almost unsurprised. When he finished, she stared into the stove's fire. Eleanor expected this. My grandmother? Lillian nodded. She trusted the land more than people. That isn't an answer. No, Lillian said softly. It isn't. Before Graham could push further, another voice interrupted. Well, look at that. Both turned. An older man stood near the edge of the clearing. Tall, weathered, grey beard, heavy winter coat. His expression carried the comfortable confidence of someone who had lived in the area his entire life. Thought I saw tire tracks. The man approached slowly. Name Silas. Graham recognized the name from a survey report. Neighboring property owner. Silas glanced toward the cabin and chuckled. Can't believe the old mud dome's still standing. Graham's jaw tightened. The what? The mud dome? Silas pointed openly. Earth, straw, clay. He laughed. Most ridiculous house I ever saw. Lillian said nothing. She simply kept stacking wood. Silas continued. Your grandmother built that thing decades ago. Everybody told her it'd collapse. It didn't, Graham said. No. Silas looked at the curved walls. That's the annoying part. The old man walked toward the outdoor stove. His boots crunched through the snow. You still using this setup? Why? Because it makes no sense. He kicked lightly at one of the stone supports. Stove outside, heat outside. He shook his head. First serious winter storm ought to freeze this place solid. Something about the certainty in his voice irritated Graham. Funny, he said. It hasn't happened yet. Silas shrugged. Luck lasts longer than people think. Lillian finally looked up. Not luck. Silas rolled his eyes. Here we go. It's an earth-sheltered house, Lillian said calmly. A what? Designed for winter survival. Silas barked out a laugh. There isn't a survival expert in Vermont who'd pick this thing. Then they don't understand it. The words landed harder than Graham expected. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted through the trees. Then Silas pointed toward the cabin. Whatever's inside there better be worth all this trouble. Lillian's expression changed, only slightly, but Graham noticed, and apparently so did Silas. The older man's eyes narrowed. You still hiding something in there? Silence, too much silence. Silas slowly smiled. Well, he stepped backward. Guess that answers that. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the trees. Graham watched him disappear into the forest. Then he faced his mother. What did he mean? Lillian stared at the cabin. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she looked at him. The missing page isn't missing. The wind seemed to stop. Graham felt his heartbeat quicken. What? She pointed toward the cabin door. It was never lost. Then where is it? Lillian's eyes moved to the center of the house, to the stone slab, the same stone she had pointed at the day before. The last page, she said quietly, is hidden somewhere Marla would never go when winter comes. Graham followed her gaze, back to the floor, back to the stone. And for the first time, he realized she wasn't talking about the cabin. She was talking about something buried inside it. Graham stepped into the cabin before the daylight disappeared completely. The air inside felt different from outside. Not warm exactly, but steady. The cold that bit through his coat, the forest, seemed weaker once the thick curved walls closed around him. Lillian followed more slowly. Her breathing sounded rougher than it had that morning. He noticed it immediately. You should sit down. I've survived worse winters than this. That wasn't an answer. A faint smile appeared on her face. No, it wasn't. The stone slab sat in the center of the cabin floor. It looked ordinary. A flat piece of gray stone surrounded by packed earth and worn clay tiles. Nothing about it suggested secrets. Nothing suggested missing trust documents. Nothing suggested years of family lies. Yet Lillian kept staring at it. Graham crouched beside the slab and ran his hand across the surface. It opens, eventually. What does that mean? It means Eleanor never built anything for impatient people. He exhaled. That sounded exactly like something his grandmother would have done. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. Snow scraped softly across the roof. Winter was settling in faster than forecast. Graham examined the edges of the stone. No visible handle, no hinge, no obvious latch. Where's the mechanism? Below. That doesn't help. It wasn't designed to. Lillian lowered herself into a chair near the wall. Her face had become pale. The exhaustion she tried to hide was beginning to win. For a moment, Graham stopped thinking about documents and trusts. He thought about how many nights she had spent here alone, how many storms, how many mornings. while he believed she was comfortably living in a senior residence. The guilt hit harder every time. He forced himself back to the task. If the amendment existed, they needed it. If Marla knew about it, time mattered. He spent nearly an hour examining the floor. Nothing moved. Nothing clicked. Nothing opened. Then Lillian pointed toward the outdoor stove. The answer isn't inside. He looked up. What? The house stores heat, I know. No, she said softly. You don't. She rose carefully and walked to a shelf near the wall. From a drawer she pulled a weathered notebook. The cover was cracked leather. Its pages were swollen with age. Graham recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor Vale, his grandmother. Lillian handed it to him. Start reading. The notebook was unlike anything he expected. There were no family stories, no recipes, no sentimental memories. Page after page contained diagrams, measurements, airflow calculations, fuel consumption estimates, heat retention notes, thermal transfer sketches. The deeper he read, the stranger it became. The cabin was not designed like a normal house. It functioned like a system. The outdoor stove fed heat into stone channels buried beneath the structure. Those channels connected to a massive thermal core beneath the floor. The earth surrounding the cabin acted as insulation. Heat wasn't meant to warm rooms immediately. It was meant to charge the structure itself. Store warmth, release it slowly, survive power failures, survive blizzards, survive isolation. A survival shelter disguised as a rustic cabin. Graham looked around again. For the first time he saw the building differently. Not as a poor person's shelter, not as evidence of neglect, as engineering, crude in appearance, sophisticated in purpose. The realization embarrassed him. He had spent years selling luxury experiences to wealthy clients. Private aviation retreats, mountain estates, exclusive wilderness escapes. Yet he had dismissed this place the moment he saw mud, clay, and wood. His grandmother had understood resilience better than most people he knew. A folded sheet slipped from the notebook. It landed near his boot. Graham picked it up. A handwritten note. Only one sentence. A house that survives greed must hide its heart. He stared at the words. That's not about winter. No, Lillian said. It isn't. The room grew quiet. Outside, darkness thickened between the trees. Then headlights appeared through the window. Graham stood immediately. A pickup truck rolled into the clearing. The driver stepped out carrying a clipboard. Middle-aged, heavy coat, orange gloves, confident expression. The type of man who expected cooperation. Who is that? Lillian's face tightened. Dale. The name sounded familiar. Then Graham remembered. The local contractor mentioned in the land documents. The knock came seconds later. Dale entered after Graham opened the door. His eyes moved around the cabin with obvious amusement. Well, he said, still standing. Neither Graham nor Lillian answered. Dale handed over a folded notice. Just doing my job. Graham unfolded the paper. His jaw tightened. Demolition authorization request. Preliminary scheduling paperwork. Not finalized, but close. Very close. What is this? Property transition planning. The property hasn't been sold. Not yet. Dale shrugged. But everybody knows where it's headed. Graham studied him. Who hired you? Dale smiled. You already know Marla. Of course. The man walked into the room. His boots tracked snow across the floor. He looked around with open contempt. All this trouble over a dirt house. It isn't a dirt house, Lillian said. Dale laughed. Whatever helps you sleep, just. Then he pointed toward the center stone. Funny thing though, nobody spoke. Dale continued. Your aunt seems awfully interested in that part of the floor. The room froze. Graham felt every muscle tighten. What do you mean? Dale immediately realized he had said too much. His expression changed, only slightly. But enough, I don't mean anything, you just did. Forget it. No. Graham stepped closer. What did Marla ask about? Dale looked uncomfortable now. Nothing important. Try again. The contractor shifted his weight. She wanted measurements. Of what? The cabin. Specific measurements? Silence. Then Dale sighed. The center section. Neither Graham nor Lillian spoke. The answer landed heavily. Marla knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to care about the floor. Enough to send someone. Enough to prepare demolition before ownership changed. Enough to worry about what might still be hidden. Dale suddenly seemed eager to leave. Anyway, weather report says a storm's coming. He nodded toward Lillian. You ought to get her somewhere warmer. Then he left. The truck disappeared back into the trees. The cabin fell silent again. Only the wind remained. Graham looked down at the notice in his hand. then at the notebook, then at the stone slab. She knows. Lillian nodded. Yes, how long I don't know. You should have told me sooner. The words escaped before he could stop them. Pain crossed her face. Not anger, pain, the kind that came from hearing an old wound spoken aloud. I tried. His throat tightened. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Lillian walked slowly toward the center of the room. She rested one hand against the stone. Eleanor always said greed makes people impatient. Graham stepped beside her. And the thermal core has to be warm enough before it can open safely, he frowned. What does that mean? The access seal is below the stone. The realization hit him. The stone itself wasn't the hiding place. Something existed underneath it. Something protected by the heating system. Something Eleanor had intentionally buried inside the structure. How long? A day, maybe 2. We don't have 2 days, I know. The wind slammed against the cabin, harder this time. The walls held. But outside winter was arriving, fast. Lillian suddenly coughed, once, then again. The second cough lingered. Graham moved toward her immediately. You need rest. She nodded but looked exhausted. The color had drained from her face. Her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time fear slipped through her calm exterior. Not fear for herself, fear for the secret. Fear that Marla would reach it first. Hours later, after Lillian finally fell asleep, Graham sat alone beside the notebook. He continued reading page after page, diagram after diagram. Then near the back he found something different, a list, 3 locations, 3 copies, 1 marked cabin, 1 marked attorney, and 1 final entry, hidden in thermal core access. Graham's heartbeat accelerated. He read it again, then a third time. There it was. Proof that the missing page had never been lost, but another line beneath it chilled him even more. A note written in Eleanor's hand years earlier. If the cabin copy disappears, assume someone inside the family already knows where to look. Graham stared at the words, then slowly looked toward the sleeping figure of his mother, because for the first time he realized something terrifying. Marla had not been searching blindly. She had been hunting for the same document for years. The storm arrived before dawn. Graham woke to the sound of wind pressing against the cabin walls like a living thing. Snow rattled across the roof. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked and crashed into the darkness. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then he saw Eleanor's notebook beside him. The thermal core, the hidden amendment. Marla. Everything came rushing back. He stood and immediately checked on Lillian. She was awake but looked worse. The color in her face had faded overnight. Her shoulders seemed smaller somehow. When she tried to sit up, a cough caught her halfway through the movement. Graham crossed the room. You need a doctor. I need breakfast. You need a doctor, she smiled weakly. 1 problem at a time. Normally he would have argued. This time he didn't. He could see the strain in her breathing. The cold of the previous weeks had left damage behind. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the slow, dangerous exhaustion that came from living too long without proper support. The realization made his stomach tighten. Someone with private jets and millions of dollars had allowed his mother to reach this point. Not intentionally, but it had happened anyway. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, Graham focused on the notebook. If Eleanor had left instructions, they would be there. Page after page described airflow systems, fuel storage calculations, and emergency procedures. Some sections looked more like engineering manuals than personal notes. Then he found a sketch. The drawing showed the thermal core beneath the floor, stone chambers, heat channels, access points, and 1 narrow compartment marked only with a symbol. No words. No explanation. Just a small hand-drawn star. He stared at it. Lillian, she looked up. What does this mean? The moment she saw the page, her expression changed. Eleanor's star. What was inside? I never knew. You never checked? Lillian shook her head. She told me it was only for the day the family stopped trusting itself. The answer landed heavily. Because that day had clearly arrived. Graham studied the diagram again. The hidden compartment was deeper than the main access chamber. If the amendment existed there, they would have 1 chance to retrieve it before Marla moved again. But first they needed the thermal core warm enough to open safely. The problem was time. Every hour mattered. Every hour also brought the storm closer. The cabin needed heat, Lillian needed heat, and Graham had no idea what he was doing. By mid-morning, he was outside fighting with the stove. The process seemed absurd. a wealthy aviation executive standing in a blizzard trying to learn 19th century heating techniques from a notebook. His first attempt failed completely. Smoke pushed backward through the system. Heat escaped instead of building. His second attempt wasn't much better. When he finally returned inside, frustrated and freezing, he found Lillian watching him. Not laughing, not judging, just watching. Eleanor used to say, "The stove punished people who rushed." I'm beginning to hate Eleanor. That earned a genuine smile, for the first time in days. Good, what does that mean? It means you're finally meeting her. The warmth in her voice surprised him. Not because of what she said, because of what wasn't there. Blame. Lillian had every reason to blame him. Years of missed signs, years of trusting Marla, years of believing convenient explanations. Yet she rarely did. That somehow hurt more. By afternoon the system finally began responding. The stone floor felt different beneath Graham's boots. Not hot, but alive. Heat slowly moved through the structure. Stored, held, protected, exactly as Eleanor intended. The cabin became noticeably warmer. Outside, the storm worsened. Inside, the thermal mass house started doing what it was designed to do. Graham checked weather updates whenever a signal appeared. Road closures, power outages, fallen trees, emergency advisories. Half the region seemed to be shutting down. The irony wasn't lost on him. Luxury homes throughout the county were losing electricity. Meanwhile, the strange little earth-sheltered cabin, everyone mocked, continued holding heat. Toward evening, another surprise arrived. A knock, 3 hard strikes. Graham opened the door cautiously. Silas stood outside. Snow covered his coat. His beard was white with ice. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Silas held up a bag. Wood stove supplies, medicine, soup. I figured she'd need these. Graham stared at him. The old man shifted awkwardly. Don't make this weird, it already is. Silas grunted. Fair. They let him inside. For a while he simply sat near the stove, watching, listening. Eventually his eyes settled on the notebook. Eleanor's book. You recognize it? Graham asked. Everyone recognized it. What does that mean? Silas rubbed his hands together. It means your grandmother scared people. That wasn't the answer Graham expected. Silas continued. She wasn't afraid of anyone. Not even Marla? The old man laughed once. Especially not Marla. The room went quiet. A new piece of the puzzle had appeared. Graham leaned forward. You knew there was conflict between them? Silas hesitated, then nodded. For years. Why didn't anyone tell me? Silas looked directly at him. Would you have listened? The question hit harder than Graham expected, because the answer was obvious. Probably not. Back then, he trusted Marla. Marla handled paperwork. Marla managed finances. Marla always had explanations, and Graham was always busy. The silence stretched. Finally, Silas sighed. Eleanor thought somebody would come after the trust eventually. What trust? The forest. We know about that. No, Silas said quietly. You know about the land. The distinction mattered. Graham could feel it immediately. What are you saying? Silas looked toward Lillian. She nodded once. Only then did he continue. Eleanor never believed the forest was the real asset. Every nerve in Graham's body tightened. What was? I don't know. The answer came too quickly. Too carefully. A lie, not a complete lie, but not the truth. Silas knew more. Graham could see it. Lillian could too. Yet neither pushed him. Not yet. Because the old man had already given them something important. The trust wasn't just protecting trees. It was protecting something else. Something valuable enough for Eleanor to hide. Something valuable enough for Marla to spend years chasing. Darkness settled outside. The storm deepened. Silas eventually left before the roads became impossible. The cabin returned to silence. Hours later, the thermal core reached the temperature marked in Eleanor's notebook. Graham and Lillian stood over the center stone. Neither spoke. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Carefully following the instructions, Graham released the first latch, then the second. A low grinding sound echoed beneath the floor. The stone shifted. Slowly, he pulled harder. The access chamber opened. Warm air rose from below. At first he saw only darkness, then metal, a box, smaller than expected, older than expected. His pulse accelerated. Lillian's hand tightened around the edge of the stone. Graham lifted the box carefully. The lid resisted, then finally opened. Inside lay several sealed documents, a bundle of letters and one faded photograph. Graham picked up the photograph first. The moment he saw it, everything inside him stopped, because standing beside Eleanor in the picture was not just Lillian. It was Marla, and both women were staring at the camera while holding the exact same leather ledger Graham had never seen before. Attached to the photograph was a handwritten note in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. If either of them claims they never knew, this picture proves they are lying. Graham read the note 3 times before he finally looked up. The storm continued outside, rattling the cabin walls, but the sound seemed distant now. Lillian stared at the photograph in silence. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, from recognition. "Eleanor wrote that herself," she said quietly. Graham nodded. The handwriting matched every page in the notebook, every diagram, every warning, every calculation. There was no question about its authenticity. He looked again at the photograph. The image was old but clear. Lillian stood beside Eleanor. Marla stood on the other side. All 3 women appeared serious. Between them sat the leather ledger. The same ledger. The same object Eleanor had apparently considered important enough to hide beneath the thermal core. Graham felt something shift inside him. Until now, he had believed Marla spent years searching for something she never possessed. The photograph changed that. Marla had known, not guessed, known, which meant one painful possibility could no longer be ignored. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked softly. Lillian closed her eyes. For several seconds she said nothing. The silence itself became an answer. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded tired. "Marla wasn't always like this." Graham remained quiet. "Years ago, before the trust changed, Eleanor brought both of us into the project." "The project?" "The survival system." Graham glanced around the cabin. The cabin, the forest, everything connected to it. The answer only created more questions. Lillian sat down slowly beside the thermal core access chamber. She looked older than she had even a week earlier. The stress was catching up to her. We all knew the forest mattered, but Eleanor believed something else mattered more. "What preparedness?" Graham frowned. "For disasters, for failure." The word hung in the air. "Eleanor didn't trust systems," Lillian continued. "Not banks, not power grids, not markets, not politicians. She thought communities survived because ordinary people prepared before emergencies arrived." The notebook suddenly made more sense. The engineering, the stored heat, the hidden compartments, the detailed fuel calculations. This had never been eccentricity. It had been a philosophy, a practical one. But why hide legal documents inside it? Lillian looked toward the open metal box. Because Eleanor eventually stopped trusting people too. That answer hit harder than Graham expected. The cabin wasn't merely protection from winter. It was protection from greed, protection from manipulation, protection from family. He opened the metal box further. Inside lay several envelopes. Some were sealed. Others had already been opened long ago. One carried Eleanor's handwriting. "For the day truth becomes expensive." Graham carefully removed it. The seal had never been broken. His pulse quickened. He looked at Lillian. She nodded. "Open it." Inside were several folded documents. The first appeared to be a trust amendment. The second looked like supporting legal correspondence. The third was something else entirely, a letter addressed to the trustee. Graham unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled with age. The contents were brief, direct, specific. Eleanor stated that any trustee who attempted to sell trust land for personal financial benefit should immediately lose management authority upon independent verification of that conduct. She also referenced attached documentation, supporting evidence, protective provisions, removal procedures. Graham looked up. "This is huge. It helps." "No, it changes everything, only if it can be verified." The reminder grounded him immediately. She was right. One document alone solved nothing. Everything still required confirmation, county records, trust filings, legal review, independent evidence. Marla would fight every step. The storm howled outside as if agreeing. Then Graham found the ledger. He had expected financial records. What he discovered was worse. Page after page documented transfers, contributions, maintenance cost, trust-related expenses. The entries stretched across years, then decades. Many names appeared repeatedly. Local contractors, forestry consultants, surveyors, attorneys. Most looked ordinary. Until one section near the back, there Marla's name appeared again and again, highlighted, annotated, questioned. Graham read several entries. His stomach tightened. Eleanor had started tracking suspicious expenditures years before her death. Not accusations, not conclusions. Questions. Why was this withdrawal requested? Why was this invoice redirected? Why was this payment rushed? Each note became more concerned than the last. The pattern was unmistakable. Eleanor had become suspicious long before anyone else, perhaps long before Lillian, perhaps even before Marla realized she was being watched. A sudden cough interrupted his thoughts. He turned. Lillian was bent forward in her chair, struggling. The coughing continued, longer this time, harder. Graham crossed the room immediately. Her skin felt warm. Too warm. Fear surged through him. "You're running a fever." "I'm fine." "No," she tried to protest. Another cough stopped her. The storm outside had already closed most roads. Medical care was still possible, but every hour narrowed their options. For the first time, Graham felt genuinely trapped. Not financially, not professionally, personally, the kind of helplessness money couldn't fix. He hated it. Several hours later, the cabin remained warm, but Lillian's condition hadn't improved. The fever lingered, her breathing sounded shallow. Not critical, not yet, but concerning. Graham finally made a decision. He stepped outside and climbed the hill behind the cabin. The signal there was weak, intermittent, barely usable. After 20 frustrating minutes, one call finally connected. Helen Ross, the probate attorney. The connection crackled constantly, but it held. Graham explained everything: the amendment, the letter, the ledger, the photograph. Helen listened carefully, then asked the question he least wanted to hear. "Can you prove chain of custody?" He closed his eyes. Of course. The lawyer wasn't being difficult, she was being realistic. Evidence mattered. Process mattered. Marla's attorneys would attack everything. "Not yet, then protect everything I am." "No," Helen said. "You think you are, that's different." The wind roared through the trees. Helen continued, "Photograph every document, make copies when possible. Keep originals secure. Document who found them, document when, document where." Graham pulled out a notebook immediately. "Anything else?" A long pause followed. Then Helen spoke more carefully. "There's something you should know." His pulse quickened. "What?" "I checked filing indexes before the storm knocked out access." Graham waited. The amendment wasn't the only document that disappeared from the record. Every muscle in his body tightened. What else was missing? "I don't know yet." "Then what do you know?" "The missing page wasn't removed by accident." Her voice grew quieter. "Someone systematically altered the trust record." The words landed like ice. Not one page, not one mistake, a pattern, a deliberate effort, years in the making. After the call ended, Graham stood alone in the storm. Snow whipped across the ridge. The forest below looked endless. Somewhere inside that darkness sat the cabin. Inside the cabin sat his mother, feverish, exhausted, still protecting a secret after all these years. And somewhere beyond the forest sat Marla, preparing her next move. When Graham returned, he found Lillian awake. She wasn't looking at the ledger or the amendment. She was holding one of the unopened envelopes from the metal box. Her face had gone pale. "What is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed him the envelope. His name was written across the front, not in Eleanor's handwriting, not in Lillian's, Marla's. Graham stared at it. The seal was still intact, never opened, never mailed, never delivered. Lillian swallowed hard. "I've never seen that before." Graham carefully turned the envelope over. A second line had been written beneath his name. The ink was faded but readable. To be opened only if he learns what the forest was really protecting. Slowly, Graham broke the seal. Graham unfolded the letter carefully. The paper was older than he expected. The ink had faded slightly, but Marla's handwriting remained unmistakable. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he began reading. "If you are opening this, it means Eleanor was right." The first sentence hit him harder than he expected. Lillian leaned forward despite her exhaustion. "What does it say?" Graham continued. "It means the forest is no longer protected by trust alone. It means someone has already started looking for what was hidden beneath it." His eyes moved faster. The letter wasn't emotional. It wasn't apologetic. It read like a warning. Years before the current conflict ever began. Years before the accusations. Years before Marla became the person Graham now knew, or thought he knew. The next paragraph stopped him cold. "Eleanor never trusted me completely. She was probably right not to." The cabin remained silent except for the storm outside. Graham read the line twice, then a third time. It felt impossible. The Marla described in public records and recent conversations never admitted fault, never admitted weakness, never admitted anything, yet here she was. In her own handwriting, doing exactly that. What year was this written? Lillian asked. Graham checked the date. His stomach tightened. Almost 12 years earlier, long before the trust dispute, long before Graham's business became successful enough to attract national attention, long before Marla's failed resort investment. This wasn't a reaction to the current crisis. This had been written years in advance. He kept reading. If someone is reading this because the trust has become a battlefield, then the danger is no longer the forest itself. The danger is what people believe the forest contains. Graham looked up. What does that mean? Lillian shook her head slowly. I don't know. For the first time since finding her in the cabin, he believed her completely. She truly didn't know. The mystery extended beyond her, beyond him, perhaps even beyond Marla. The letter continued. People assume the survival system was built for storms. That is only partly true. Eleanor believed information needed protection as much as people did. A chill ran through him. Information, not gold, not cash, not buried treasure, information. The idea felt strangely more dangerous. The next page referenced sealed records, duplicate filings, protected copies, verification procedures. It sounded less like a family letter and more like instructions. Then he found the line that changed everything. There are 3 places where the truth survives. If one is destroyed, the others remain. Graham sat straighter, his pulse accelerated. Finally, something concrete. He read further. The first location remains inside the survival system. The second was entrusted to legal protection. The third was entrusted to someone who never understood what they were carrying. What does that mean? Lillian whispered. Graham didn't answer, because he didn't know. The letter never explained, not directly. Instead, Marla wrote another warning. If the third copy is ever found, do not assume the holder is guilty. They may not even know what they possess. The sentence lingered in the room. Neither of them spoke. A sudden knock shattered the silence. 3 hard knocks, then 2 more. Graham stood instantly. His hand moved toward the flashlight. The storm had worsened. Nobody should have been out there, especially not this late. Another knock followed, louder. Lillian looked alarmed. Don't open it. Graham moved toward the window. The glass was partially frosted. He wiped away condensation. A figure stood outside beneath swirling snow, tall, broad-shouldered, holding a lantern. Not Marla, not Dale, not anyone he expected. The man lifted the lantern higher. Recognition came a moment later. Silas. Graham opened the door cautiously. Wind exploded into the cabin. Silas stepped inside. Snow covered his coat and beard. His expression looked grim. Road's gone, what? Big Pine came down across the access trail. Nobody's driving through tonight. Graham closed the door. The cabin immediately grew quiet again. Silas noticed the papers spread across the table. His eyes narrowed. You found something. Neither Graham nor Lillian answered. That was answer enough. Silas sighed heavily. Then he removed his gloves. I figured you would. The statement immediately caught Graham's attention. What does that mean? Silas stared at the thermal core, at the metal box, at the old photograph. His expression changed. Not surprise, recognition, a dangerous kind. You found Eleanor's backup records. Graham felt his pulse jump again. How do you know about them? Silas hesitated. For a moment he seemed to consider leaving. Then something inside him shifted. Maybe guilt, maybe exhaustion, maybe fear. I helped build part of this place. The room fell silent. Lillian blinked. You what? Silas nodded slowly. Eleanor hired me years ago. The revelation landed like another blow. For days Silas had mocked the cabin, mocked the design, mocked the survival system. Yet he had helped build it. Why? The question appeared on Graham's face. Silas answered before he could ask. Because I was ashamed. Ashamed of what? Being wrong. The older man sat heavily near the stove. His shoulders sagged. I thought Eleanor was crazy. He looked around the cabin. Most of us did. Graham listened carefully. Then the ice storm happened. Silas stared into the fire, the big one, power gone, roads closed, half the county freezing. His voice softened. This cabin stayed warm. Lillian watched him quietly. Silas continued. People laughed at her before that storm. They stopped laughing afterward. The confession felt genuine, not dramatic, just tired, the kind of truth people carried too long. Then his expression darkened. And that's when outsiders started paying attention. Graham immediately focused. What outsiders? Silas looked towards the documents. The same kind who always show up when land becomes valuable. Developers, investors. Speculators. People chasing opportunity. People like Graham himself. The realization hurt, Silas noticed. You weren't the first rich man interested in this forest. Graham said nothing, because he knew Silas was right. The old man leaned forward. Eleanor understood something most people didn't. What? People kept looking at the trees. His eyes shifted toward the floor beneath them, when they should have been looking underneath. Every nerve in Graham's body tightened. Underneath what? Silas hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. It sounded truthful, frustratingly truthful, but someone else did. The room went still. Outside, wind hammered the walls. Inside, nobody moved. Graham's voice became quiet. Who? Silas swallowed. His answer came slowly. About 8 years ago, I saw Marla meet with somebody. Lillian stiffened. Who? I never learned his name. Then what matters? Silas looked directly at Graham. The map. What map? The one he showed her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the heat. Silas continued. It wasn't a property survey. It wasn't a timber map. It wasn't zoning. His voice lowered. It was a subsurface map. Graham felt his stomach twist. Subsurface. Under the forest. Under the land. Under the cabin. Silas reached into his coat pocket. For a moment nobody breathed. Then he removed a folded piece of paper. Old, worn, weathered. I kept this because it bothered me. He handed it to Graham. Graham unfolded it carefully. His blood ran cold. The drawing showed the forest, the cabin, the trust boundaries, and beneath them, marked in faded red ink, was a network of underground structures extending far beyond anything Lillian had ever described. At the bottom of the page, one handwritten note appeared beside a circled location, Eleanor's original archive. Status, not yet recovered. The words at the bottom of the map refused to leave Graham's mind. Eleanor's original archive. Status, not yet recovered. For several moments nobody spoke. The storm pressed against the cabin walls. Wind hissed through the trees. The thermal core beneath the floor radiated steady warmth, but Graham still felt cold. Where did you get this? He finally asked. Silas rubbed his weathered hands together. I found it years ago. Found it where? In Marla's truck. The answer came so quickly that Graham almost missed it. Silas looked embarrassed. I was repairing a hydraulic line for her. The map slid out from under a folder. Lillian stared at him. And you never told me? Silas lowered his eyes. I thought it was survey work. The silence that followed carried years of regret. Graham wanted to be angry. Instead, he saw something worse. Shame. The kind that settled into a person and stayed there. Silas had spent years mocking the cabin. Years dismissing Eleanor and Lillian as eccentric women obsessed with survival systems. Now Graham realized something painful. People had not ignored them because they lacked evidence. People had ignored them because they were easier to laugh at. He folded the map carefully. Who was the man with Marla? Silas shook his head. No name. What did he look like? City guy. Expensive coat, expensive boots. Didn't belong here. That description could fit hundreds of people. Developers, investors, consultants, buyers. The list felt endless. Lillian suddenly leaned forward. Wait. Both men looked at her. Her eyes remained fixed on the map. Show me the red circle again. Graham slid the paper across the table. She studied it for several seconds. Then her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. I've seen this location. Graham's pulse jumped. Where? She pointed toward the northeast corner of the forest, near an old creek line, far beyond the cabin, far beyond the trust property's public trail system. Eleanor called that place the Quiet Hollow. What's there? I don't know. The answer frustrated him. Then she added something else. But she never let anyone go there alone. That got his attention. Why not? Lillian stared into the fire. She always said the forest remembered more than people did. Silas groaned softly. That sounds exactly like Eleanor. For the first time all night, a faint smile touched Lillian's face. It disappeared quickly, because the reality remained. Someone else had known about Quiet Hollow. Someone else had been searching, and according to the map, they had never found what they wanted. Yet, the next morning arrived gray and brutal. The storm had weakened but not disappeared. Road crews were still clearing fallen trees. Cell service returned in fragments, enough for calls, enough for problems. Graham stepped outside with his phone. 3 voicemails waited, all from Marla. The first sounded controlled. The second sounded irritated. The third sounded angry. By the 4th message, she was no longer pretending. If you're with your mother, call me immediately. The 5th voicemail arrived less than an hour later. This has gone far enough, Graham. The sixth contained no greeting, only a warning, you're being manipulated. He deleted none of them. Instead, he forwarded every message to a secure folder. Then he called Helen Ross. The probate attorney answered immediately. Please tell me you found something useful. We found a map. A pause. What kind of map? Graham explained. Not all of it. Just enough. Helen listened carefully. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. Maps don't prove ownership, I know. They don't prove fraud. I know, but they prove intent. That caught her attention. Graham continued. If Marla was meeting people in secret and discussing parts of the property not listed in public documents, that matters. It might. Not certainty, not victory, just possibility. That was how real investigations worked. Helen remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked a question he hadn't expected. Have you checked the trust insurance records? No. You should. Why? Because conservation trusts sometimes insure structures that aren't publicly advertised. Graham felt his heartbeat increase. Even underground structures? Sometimes. The call ended shortly afterward. A new direction had appeared. Not proof, but a trail. Inside the cabin, Lillian was drinking tea when Graham returned. Her breathing sounded stronger than the previous day. The fever had eased. The improvement relieved him more than he wanted to admit. He sat beside her. I need to drive into town. Her expression hardened immediately. For the records? He nodded. She looked toward the map, then toward the thermal core, then toward him. Be careful. I will. No, her voice sharpened. Listen carefully. He stopped. Lillian rarely interrupted people. When she did, it mattered. Eleanor trusted systems because people failed. The sentence landed heavily. She wasn't speaking about architecture. She wasn't speaking about heating systems. She was speaking about family, about Marla, about Graham, maybe even about herself. The realization hurt because she wasn't entirely wrong. 2 hours later, Graham arrived at the county administrative building. Emergency generators powered half the offices. The rest remained dark. Nora Bell was already there. She looked exhausted. Please tell me you're not bringing more surprises. No promises. That earned a tired laugh. They reviewed trust filings, insurance records, conservation documents, maintenance reports. Hours passed by. Most of it led nowhere. Then Nora stopped turning pages. Her expression changed. What? She pointed at a file. This shouldn't exist. Graham leaned closer. The document was old, nearly 20 years old, filed under a supplemental conservation protection agreement, attached to the trust, never referenced elsewhere. His pulse accelerated. What am I looking at? Nora read quietly, then looked up. The trust insured 2 protected structures. Graham froze. 2? Nora nodded. The cabin is listed. His throat tightened, and the second, she turned the page. The answer sat there in black ink. Structure B, location withheld under conservation security exemption. Annual inspection required. Access restricted to designated custodians. Graham stared. The second structure was real. Not a rumor, not a legend, not Eleanor's imagination. It existed. The room suddenly felt smaller. Who were the custodians? Nora kept reading, then frowned. That's strange. What? The names are redacted. Can they be unsealed? Possibly. Not immediately. Not today. Not easily. Reality again. Always slower than hope. But one line remained visible, one line the redactions had missed. Nora's eyes widened. Then she looked directly at Graham. You need to see this. He stepped closer. At the bottom of the page, beneath the insurance authorization, one signature remained completely visible. Not Eleanor's. Not Lillian's. Not Marla's. Graham's stomach dropped. The signature belonged to his late father, and beside it was a handwritten note dated only 3 months before his father's death. If access is ever compromised, notify Graham immediately. He must know what was hidden. Graham stared at the signature until the letters blurred. His father's name sat at the bottom of the document as plainly as if the man had signed it yesterday. Beside it was the handwritten note. If access is ever compromised, notify Graham immediately. He must know what was hidden. For a moment, the noise of the generator disappeared. The county office disappeared. Everything disappeared except one question. Why? Why him? His father had never mentioned a second structure, never mentioned an archive, never mentioned anything hidden beneath the forest. Nora carefully closed the file. Are you okay? No, the answer came honestly. She nodded. That's probably the correct response. Graham photographed every page he was legally allowed to copy. Then he requested certified copies through the proper process. Nothing moved fast, nothing ever did. But the paper trail was growing, and unlike stories, paper trails were difficult to erase completely. By the time he returned to the cabin, darkness had already settled over the forest. The storm had weakened further. The sky remained heavy. The woods felt quieter, too quiet. Lillian sat beside the thermal core reading Eleanor's notebook when he entered. She looked up immediately. The expression on his face told her something had changed. What happened? Graham handed her the copied page. She adjusted her glasses, read, then read it again. Her hand trembled slightly. Your father knew. The words sounded almost painful. Graham sat across from her. Did you know he knew? No, she answered instantly. Too instantly to be a lie. Her confusion looked real. That made the situation worse, not better. If Lillian hadn't known, then his father had kept the secret from both of them. Silas, who had been repairing a loose vent panel outside, stepped into the cabin and saw their expressions. Bad news? We found proof my father knew about the second structure. Silas stopped moving. The old man looked genuinely surprised. I thought Eleanor only trusted herself. So did everyone else, Lillian said quietly. The statement lingered, because it carried another truth. Everyone had underestimated Eleanor, again. Graham unfolded the map from the previous night and placed it beside the insurance record. 2 pieces of a puzzle, neither complete, but clearly connected. His eyes moved between them. Then something caught his attention, a tiny marking, barely visible, near the red circle identifying Quiet Hollow. At first he thought it was damage. Then he realized it wasn't. It was a handwritten symbol, a triangle. Inside the triangle sat 2 initials, RV. His breath caught. Vale, not Eleanor's initials, not Lillian's, his father's, Richard Vale. Lillian saw it seconds later. Oh my God, the room became silent. Even Silas leaned closer. What does it mean? Nobody knew, but the placement mattered. The initials sat directly beside the hidden archive location. Not beside the cabin, not beside trust boundaries, only beside the archive. Graham immediately photographed the map. Then he called Helen. She answered on the second ring. He explained what they had found. The signature, the insurance document, the initials, the second structure. Helen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she remained silent for several moments. Then she asked a question that shifted everything. Did your father have authority inside the trust? I think so. Don't think. The attorney's voice sharpened. No. Graham rubbed his forehead. Why does it matter? Because if Richard was a designated custodian, he may have filed separate documents. His pulse accelerated. Separate from the trust? Possibly. Where? Private archives, legal storage, estate records. The possibility opened an entirely new path, a path Marla might not know existed, or one she had been desperately trying to find. Helen continued, I'll search probate references tomorrow. Tomorrow may be too late. You think Marla is moving? I know she is. That wasn't speculation anymore. Not after the messages, not after the forged narratives, not after the missing pages. Marla was running out of time, and people running out of time became dangerous. The next morning confirmed it. At 7:14 a.m., Graham received an email. Not from Marla. From one of his own employees. The subject line contained only 4 words. Urgent. Please call me. His stomach tightened. He stepped outside before returning the call. The employee sounded nervous. There's a problem. What kind of problem? A buyer inquiry. Graham froze. What buyer? The retreat project. The words immediately set off alarms. He had already paused negotiations. Nothing should have been moving. Nothing. Yet somehow someone had been contacting stakeholders behind his back. His employee continued. They said the forest sale was still expected to close. Graham's grip tightened around the phone. Who said that? A pause, then the answer. Marla. For several seconds he couldn't speak. She was still pushing the deal. Even now, even after everything, the call ended. Graham stood in the snow staring toward the trees. The realization felt heavier than before. This was no longer about money alone. The amount involved couldn't explain the risk. Couldn't explain the years of manipulation. Couldn't explain why someone had searched for underground archives. Couldn't explain why his father had been involved. Something larger sat beneath the surface. Something worth protecting. Or stealing. When he returned inside, Lillian immediately noticed his expression. What happened? Marla is still trying to close the sale. Lillian's face lost color. Silas swore under his breath. Nobody seemed surprised anymore. That was the frightening part. The behavior had become expected, normal, predictable, like weather. Graham sat down and opened Eleanor's notebook again. For hours he read every page. Most contained technical notes, heating calculations, fuel estimates, wind patterns, emergency procedures. Then he found something different, a section near the back, written in smaller handwriting, almost hidden between maintenance entries. At first it looked like random numbers. Then he noticed dates, coordinates, initials, references, a record. Not financial, not engineering, personal. His heartbeat increased. Lillian moved beside him. "What is it?" "I don't know yet." Together they examined the pages. Several names appeared. Most meant nothing. Some belonged to local contractors. A few belonged to attorneys. Then one name appeared repeatedly. Richard Vale, his father, page after page, year after year, notations, transfers, inspections, conversations. The notebook revealed something unexpected. Richard had not been a distant participant, he had been deeply involved. Maybe more involved than anyone else. Near the final entry, Graham found a folded sheet hidden between pages. Unlike everything else, this document had never been attached, never indexed, never referenced. It looked intentionally concealed. His hands tightened as he unfolded it. A photograph slipped out first, old, faded, taken decades earlier. 3 adults stood beside a partially completed underground entrance. Eleanor, Richard, and a third person. Someone Graham had never seen before. The stranger's face was circled in red ink. On the back of the photograph, Eleanor had written a single sentence. "If anything happens to Richard, do not trust Thomas Mercer with the archive. He already knows where it is." Graham did not sleep after finding Thomas Mercer's name. By morning, Helen Ross had already begun pulling what records she could reach. The storm had slowed the county, but it had not stopped paperwork. By noon, she had enough to call an emergency trust review. Not a trial, not a dramatic public judgment, just the first real mechanism Marla could not charm her way around. The meeting took place 2 days later inside the town firehouse because half the county buildings still had power issues. Lillian sat beside Graham, wrapped in a wool coat, pale but steady. Across the folding tables sat Marla in a tailored camel coat, her face calm in the way people looked when they had rehearsed their innocence. She began with concern. Lillian was unstable. Graham was overwhelmed. The cabin was unsafe. The land sale needed to close before the buyer withdrew. She made every sentence sound reasonable. That had always been her gift. Then Helen placed the documents on the table. The amendment from the thermal core, the county index showing the missing page, the insurance record proving a second protected structure, the ledger entries Eleanor had kept, the returned letters, the email forwarding records, the confirmation from Green Hollow that Lillian had never lived there, Graham's own transfer history showing money sent for his mother's care and then redirected through accounts Marla controlled. Marla's expression changed only once, when Dale Palmer's invoices appeared. Graham watched the color leave her face as Helen explained that Dale had turned over messages showing Marla had asked for demolition scheduling before the sale was finalized. Not after. Before. The cabin had not been a hazard she wanted removed. It had been evidence she wanted gone. Marla tried to speak, but Lillian raised one hand. For the first time in years, everyone at that table looked at her. "I am not refusing care," Lillian said, her voice thin but clear. "I am refusing control." The room went still. Graham felt those words settle into him. He had spent years thinking care meant arranging things from a distance. Marla had spent years using care as a leash. Lillian had just named the difference. The trust board voted to freeze the land sale that afternoon. Marla lost temporary signing authority before she left the firehouse. A neutral fiduciary was appointed to manage trust accounts while the records were reviewed. The court did not decide everything in a single hour, because real consequences rarely worked that way. But one thing happened immediately. Marla could no longer touch the money, the land, the cabin, or Lillian. Over the next several weeks, the truth became less emotional and more documented. Bank traces showed care funds had been diverted into Marla's failed resort debt. The old amendment was matched against the county's archived index. Graham's transfer records matched entries in Eleanor's ledger. A capacity evaluation confirmed that Lillian understood her medical needs, her property rights, and the decisions before her. She needed support. She did not need to be erased. Marla signed a mediated settlement after the fiduciary review left her with fewer options than excuses. She agreed to repay the verified misused funds through a court-approved schedule. Her financial power of attorney was suspended, then revoked. She was removed from trust management. The Development Council accepted her resignation after the conflict of interest became impossible to deny. Any question about altered filings was referred to the proper authorities for further review. She did not go to prison in a satisfying flash. She did not collapse in public and confess everything. She lost something more fitting: access, control, the ability to decide what everyone else was allowed to know. Dale lost his demolition contract and was required to turn over every message, invoice, and scheduling note tied to the cabin. Thomas Mercer turned out to be a consultant tied to an old resort feasibility study, a man who had known about the archive but never gained access. He had not been the mastermind. He had been another person circling the forest because he believed something valuable lay under it. In the end, what lay under it was not gold. It was proof. Proof that Eleanor had expected greed. Proof that Richard Vale had known enough to leave Graham's name in the record. Proof that Lillian had not been confused, unstable, or difficult. She had been protecting the one place where the family could not easily rewrite the truth. Silas came back one cold morning with lumber, tools, and a quiet face. He did not give Lillian a long apology. He replaced the broken overhang above the outdoor stove. He sealed a gap near the vent line. He stacked wood until his gloves were soaked through. Only when he finished did he look at her. I laughed because it was easier than admitting I didn't understand it. Lillian looked at the repaired stove cover, then at him. Understanding late is still better than never, that was all she said. It was enough. Graham cancelled the retreat project permanently. Some investors were angry. Some clients thought he had lost his edge. He let them think what they wanted. For once, he did not explain himself to people who only understood land when it could be priced. He placed money into the trust for maintenance, medical support, and restoration, but he did not take control. That mattered. He asked Lillian what she wanted before signing anything. Sometimes she answered quickly. Sometimes she needed time. Either way, he waited. By spring, she chose a small house near town for the days when weather or health made the cabin too hard. But she did not give the cabin up. The forest house remained protected under the trust, not as a luxury retreat, but as an emergency shelter for the community during power failures. Managed under rules Lillian helped write herself. The next winter, another storm crossed northern Vermont. The power failed before sunset, but the cabin glowed. Inside, the floor held warmth. Outside, the stove burned low and steady beneath the repaired overhang. Graham sat beside it, adding wood slower than he used to, finally understanding that panic wasted fuel. Lillian stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick sweater, watching him with tired eyes that no longer looked afraid. "You came all this way for firewood," she said. Graham glanced toward the snow-covered clearing. "I came because I should have come sooner." She did not tell him it was all right. It wasn't, but after a moment she stepped aside and let him carry the wood, and that was where healing began. Not with a speech, not with money. With a door held open, a fire kept steady, and a mother finally believed. What would you have done first? Forgive, walk away, or fight to restore the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments.